The scream from the eastern gate reached the palace before the messenger did, and Ren Sable dropped her basket of dried herbs the moment she heard it. She had been standing at the edge of the market square, in the border village of Ashcombe, waiting to deliver medicine to a sick child, when the sound tore through the morning air. People around her froze. A merchant's cart tipped over. Somewhere behind her, a woman began to cry. Ren did not wait to find out what had happened. She ran toward the sound, because that was what a healer's apprentice did, even one as young and unnoticed as she was. She had spent 3 years learning under old Agnes, the village healer, mixing salves and setting bones, and not once had she imagined that a single morning would change the direction of her entire life. When she reached the gate, she found chaos. A convoy from the capital had arrived, its horses lathered with sweat, its guards shouting orders. One of the riders had been thrown from his mount and lay groaning in the dirt, his leg bent at a wrong angle. Nobody moved to help him. They were too busy staring at the black banner that hung from the lead carriage, a banner marked with the silver wolf of the royal house of Veyrath. Ren did not know why the royal house would send a convoy to a village as small as Ashcombe, and she did not have time to wonder. She knelt beside the fallen rider and began to work, her hands moving with practiced speed, even as her heart pounded. She had never touched royalty before. She had never even seen a noble in her 16 years of life, but a broken leg was a broken leg, whether it belonged to a farmer or a prince. "Hold him still," she said to the nearest guard, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to set the bone before the swelling gets worse." The guard, a broad man with a scar across his jaw, looked at her with surprise, as if he had not expected a village girl to give him an order. But something in her tone made him obey. He gripped the rider's shoulders, while Ren straightened the leg with a firm, quick motion. The rider cried out, then went pale and quiet, the pain settling into something more bearable. "You know what you are doing," the guard said, watching her bind the leg with clean linen from her satchel. She did not look up. She was already checking the rider's pulse, counting the beats under her fingers, making sure the shock had not taken too much from his body. It was only when she finished that she noticed the second carriage, the one that had not moved since the convoy arrived. Its curtains were drawn, its wheels caked in the dust of a long journey. Unlike the others, no guards stood close to it. They stood a respectful distance away, as though something inside commanded a silence they did not dare disturb. "Who is in there?" Ren asked, before she could stop herself. The scarred guard's face changed, the easy relief of a moment ago, replaced by something more careful. "That is not your concern, healer. You have done well. Take payment for your service, and return to your work." But Ren had already learned enough of the world to recognize fear when she saw it, and the guard's eyes held fear now, the kind that came from serving something greater and more fragile than himself. She rose to her feet, brushing the dirt from her knees, and looked toward the silent carriage with a curiosity she could not suppress. Before she could ask another question, an older woman stepped down from the front of the convoy, dressed in the deep blue robes that marked her as a royal physician. She studied Ren with sharp, appraising eyes. "You set that leg well," the physician said. "Better than most healers twice your age." "Thank you," Ren said, unsure whether she was being complimented or examined. "What is your name, girl?" Ren Sable." The physician's gaze lingered on her for a long moment, as if measuring something Ren could not see. Then she turned toward the carriage that no one approached, and back to Ren again. "How would you feel about a position in the capital?" Ren blinked. "I have duties here. My teacher needs me. My family needs me." "I am not asking whether you want to leave your village," the physician said, her voice gentle but firm. "I am asking whether you understand what an opportunity like this means. The royal court needs a healer with steady hands and a steadier mind. You have both. Few do." Ren looked past the physician toward the silent carriage one more time, and for a reason she could not name, a chill ran along her spine, not of fear, but of something closer to recognition, as though a door somewhere far away had just creaked open and was waiting for her to walk through it. "I need to speak with my teacher first," Ren said. "Of course," the physician replied. "We will make camp outside the village tonight. Bring your answer by morning." That evening, Ren sat across from Agnes in the small cottage that had been her home and her school for 3 years. The fire crackled between them, throwing long shadows across shelves lined with jars of dried roots and bottled tinctures. Agnes listened to the whole story without interrupting, her wrinkled hands folded in her lap. They want you for the palace, Agnes said when Ren finished, not as a question, but as a quiet statement of fact. I do not understand why. There must be healers far more skilled than me in the capital. Skill is not always the thing they are looking for, Agnes said. Sometimes what a court needs is someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of power. She reached across the small table and took Ren's hand. You have always had a gift for seeing what others miss. Perhaps that is why they have come all this way to find you. I do not want to leave you, Ren admitted, her voice thinner than she intended. And I do not want you to go, Agnes said, smiling sadly. But you were never meant to spend your whole life mixing salves in a village that will forget your name the moment you are gone. There is a bigger story waiting for you, Ren. I have felt it since you were a child. Go and find out what it is. The next morning, Ren stood before the physician, with her small bag of belongings, and her instruments wrapped carefully in cloth. She had said her goodbyes to her family in the quiet hours before dawn, her mother's tears still fresh on her mind, her father's proud but worried nod carved into her memory. I will go, she said. The physician nodded, as though she had never doubted the answer. Good. We leave within the hour. The journey to the capital took 6 days. Ren rode in a modest wagon near the back of the convoy, watching the countryside change from familiar hills to unfamiliar cliffs and forests she had only heard of in stories. She spent the hours asking the physician, whose name she learned was Nora, about the palace, about the healers who worked there, about the strange silence that clung to the second carriage like fog that never lifted. Nora answered most of her questions honestly, but whenever Ren asked about the occupant of that carriage, the older woman's expression closed like a shutting door. You will understand soon enough, Nora said each time. It is not my place to explain what belongs to the king. The king. The words settled strangely in Ren's chest. She had heard, even in her small village, whispers about the Alpha King of Veyrath, a ruler crowned 3 years ago, under circumstances no one spoke of clearly. She had heard he never left his throne room without guards flanking him like a wall of silence. She had heard, most strangely of all, that he had not spoken a single word since the night of his coronation, that his voice had vanished the same night his crown had arrived, as if the two could not exist together. She had assumed these were village stories, the kind that grew taller with every retelling, the kind meant to frighten children into obedience. But watching the guards around that second carriage, watching how even Nora seemed careful with her words, Ren began to wonder if there was truth buried somewhere beneath the rumors. On the third night of the journey, the convoy stopped near a river to water the horses, and Ren found herself sitting beside a young guard named Owen, who had been assigned to watch the healer's wagon. He was younger than the scarred guard from the village gate, perhaps only a few years older than Ren herself, and he seemed far less careful about what he said. You should know what you are walking into, Owen told her quietly, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Nora was out of earshot. The palace is not like your village. Everyone there is afraid of something, even the ones who look like they are not. Afraid of the king? Ren asked. Owen's jaw tightened. Afraid of what happened to him. Afraid of what it means that a man who used to command armies with a single word now cannot speak a syllable. Some say it is a curse. Some say it is grief, so heavy it broke something inside him that healers cannot fix. Whatever it is, no one wants to be the one who upsets him, because no one knows what a silent king is capable of when he finally reaches his limit. Has he ever hurt anyone? Ren asked, unable to hide her concern. No, Owen admitted. Not once. That is almost the strangest part. A man who lost everything and never once turned that pain into cruelty. He simply went quiet, and stayed quiet, and let the court run itself around him like water around a stone. He paused, studying her with a curious tilt of his head. A physician of Nora's rank does not travel to a border village for just any healer. I do not know, Ren admitted. I have asked myself the same question every hour of this journey. Maybe they are hoping you can succeed where every physician in the capital has failed, Owen said. Maybe they think a new pair of hands, untouched by the fear everyone else carries, might see something the rest of us cannot. Ren did not have an answer for that, and the fire crackled between them in the silence that followed, filled with unspoken questions neither of them could resolve. When Nora called for the convoy to move again, Owen helped Ren back into the wagon and gave her a small, encouraging nod before returning to his post. Do not be afraid of him, Owen said, just before she disappeared back into her seat. Whatever they say about the Silent King, I do not think fear is what he wants from the people around him. I think, more than anything, he is tired of being alone with it. Wren carried those words with her for the rest of the journey, turning them over in her mind as the wagon rattled along the long road toward the capital. She thought of Agnes, of the years spent learning to read a person's pain before they spoke it aloud, of the quiet confidence that came from knowing how to help even when words failed. Perhaps that was the gift Nora had seen in her, the reason a physician of such high standing had traveled so far to find a healer's apprentice in a village most maps did not bother to name. On the 6th evening, the towers of the capital rose into view, dark and sharp against the orange sky, and Wren felt her stomach tighten with something between excitement and dread. The Palace of Veyrath stood at the center of the city, like a crown itself, its walls carved with the shapes of wolves in mid-stride, frozen forever in stone. They passed through the outer gates as the sun sank below the horizon, torches lighting the courtyard in flickering gold. Wren stepped down from the wagon, her legs stiff from days of travel, and looked up at the palace towering above her. "Come," Nora said, gesturing for her to follow. "You will be shown to the physician's ward tonight. Tomorrow, your training in the court's ways will begin." Wren nodded, gathering her bag, and followed the physician through corridors, lined with unlit lanterns and silent guards. The palace felt colder than any place she had known, not in temperature, but in something deeper, something that pressed against her chest, like the air before a storm. She caught glimpses of servants moving quickly and quietly through side halls, their eyes down, their steps careful, as though the entire building held its breath. As they turned a final corner toward the physician's quarters, Wren's gaze drifted toward a tall set of doors at the end of a long hallway, doors carved with the same wolf sigil that marked the palace gates, doors guarded by two men who did not so much as blink. Something about those doors made her pause, made the hair on her arms rise, made her feel, for reasons she could not explain, that whoever lived behind them had been waiting a very long time for something to change. She did not know, standing there in that cold and quiet hallway, that she was about to become the reason it finally did. Nora touched her shoulder gently, pulling her attention away. "Rest tonight, Wren. Tomorrow, the real work begins." Wren followed her into a small chamber near the ward, where a simple bed and a basin of water waited. She sat on the edge of the bed once alone, her heart still racing from the journey, from the palace, from the strange doors she could not stop thinking about. Outside her window, the capital's lights flickered like scattered stars fallen to earth, and somewhere beyond the walls of her small room, in a throne room she had not yet seen, a king, who had not spoken in 3 years, sat alone in the dark, unaware that the silence that had defined his reign was about to be tested by a girl who had never meant to be found. A guard's hand closed around Wren's arm before she had even finished her first cup of morning tea, pulling her from the physician's ward with an urgency that left no room for questions. She stumbled after him through unfamiliar corridors, her instrument bag still slung over her shoulder, her mind racing to catch up with her feet. "What is happening?" she asked, trying to keep pace with his long strides. "There is no time to explain," the guard said. "A servant meant for the inner wing fell ill this morning, and the steward needs someone to deliver medicine before the midday council begins. You were the nearest healer available." Wren did not have time to argue that she had not yet been trained in the palace's protocols, that she barely knew the layout of the halls she was being rushed through. The guard pushed open a heavy door, and before she understood where she stood, she found herself in a chamber unlike any she had seen since arriving, its walls lined with tall windows, its floor covered in a carpet the color of deep river water. "Leave the medicine on the table and go," the guard instructed, already turning to leave himself, as though even he did not wish to linger in that room longer than necessary. Wren set down the small satchel of remedies as instructed, her hands moving out of habit rather than certainty, and it was only then that she noticed she was not alone. A man sat near the window, still and silent, his eyes fixed on something beyond the glass that Wren could not see. He wore simple dark clothing, unlike the ceremonial robes she had expected of a king, and there was nothing about his posture that suggested power or command. If anything, he looked like a man carrying a weight too heavy for any crown to lighten. She realized, with a jolt that traveled straight through her chest, exactly who she was looking at. "Your Majesty," she said quickly, dropping into the bow Nora had taught her the night before, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it from across the room. He did not respond, not with words, not even with the small acknowledging gesture she had expected. He simply turned his head toward her, and for the first time, Ren saw his eyes directly, a pale gray that seemed to hold both exhaustion and something sharper beneath it, something that looked almost like curiosity. "I apologize for intruding," Ren continued, unsure whether silence meant she should stay or leave. "I was told to bring medicine for the ill servant, but it seems I have been brought to the wrong chamber." Still, he said nothing. But he rose from his seat, slow and deliberate, and crossed the room toward her with a steadiness that did not match the exhaustion she had seen in his eyes only moments before. Ren held her ground, though every instinct told her to step back, to lower her gaze, to do anything but stand there, meeting the stare of a king who had not spoken in 3 years. He stopped an arm's length away and studied her the way Nora had studied her at the village gate, as though searching for something specific in the shape of her face, the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself despite clearly not belonging in this part of the palace. "I am Ren," she offered, because the silence had stretched long enough that she felt compelled to fill it with something. "Ren Sable. I only arrived last night. I am training under physician Nora." Something shifted in his expression at the sound of her name, subtle but unmistakable, like a door easing open a fraction of an inch. He tilted his head slightly, and for one strange moment, Ren felt as though he recognized her, though she was certain they had never met before in her life. The chamber door opened behind her with a sudden bang, and the palace steward, a narrow man named Perrin, with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, strode in with visible alarm. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, there has been a mistake." He turned to Ren with a look of pure irritation. You are not meant to be here. Who allowed a servant girl into the king's private chamber?" "I was told to deliver medicine," Ren said, straightening despite the way her cheeks burned under his glare. "I did not choose to come here. I was brought." "Then you will leave, immediately," Perrin said, already reaching for her arm to steer her toward the door. King Kale raised his hand. It was such a small gesture, barely more than a lift of his fingers, but the effect on Perrin was immediate. The steward froze mid-step, his mouth opening and closing without sound, his earlier confidence draining from his face like water from a cracked jug. "Your Majesty," Perrin said carefully, "surely you do not intend for her to remain." Kale did not answer him either, not with words, but he did not lower his hand, and the meaning was unmistakable to everyone in the room. Ren watched, stunned, as the most powerful man in the kingdom silently overruled his own steward, with nothing more than a raised palm, and did so, she realized slowly, to keep her from being pulled away. "I do not understand," Ren said quietly, more to herself than to either of them. Perrin straightened his robes with visible discomfort, clearly searching for a way to salvage his authority in front of the king. "It seems," he said stiffly, "that His Majesty wishes for you to remain a moment longer. I would advise you not to overstep whatever courtesy he is currently extending." "I have duties in the ward," Ren said, glancing between the two men, unsure whose expectations she was meant to follow. "Physician Nora will be looking for me." Kale turned toward Perrin and made a small motion with his hand, a gesture the steward seemed to understand instantly, though Ren did not. "He wishes for a message to be sent to the physician," Perrin translated reluctantly, "informing her that you have been detained by royal request, and that your presence will be required in the palace for the time being." "For how long?" Ren asked, feeling the walls of the chamber close in around her despite their grand height. Perrin looked to Kale, who offered nothing further, no gesture, no expression that gave away an answer. The steward exhaled sharply through his nose, clearly displeased with the position he found himself in. "That," Perrin said, "will apparently be decided by His Majesty, and His Majesty alone." Ren turned back to the king, searching his face for some explanation, some reason behind the strange authority he had just exercised on her behalf. He met her gaze steadily, and though his lips remained closed, there was something in his expression that felt almost like an apology, as if he understood how strange his silence must appear to someone who had only just arrived and knew nothing of the years that had shaped it. "I do not know why you want me here," Ren said softly, forgetting for a moment that she was speaking to a king rather than simply a man. "But I have nowhere else to be at the moment, it seems." The faintest change crossed his face at that, something that was not quite a smile, but close enough to one that Ren felt her breath catch in her throat. Perrin cleared his throat loudly, clearly uncomfortable with the exchange he was witnessing. "I will have a chamber prepared near the physician's ward," Perrin said, already moving toward the door with the brisk efficiency of a man eager to escape an uncomfortable situation. "You will remain there until further notice. I trust you understand the seriousness of royal favor, girl. It is not something to be taken lightly, nor squandered through carelessness." "I understand," Ren said, though in truth, she understood very little of what had just happened. As Perrin disappeared through the door to arrange her new quarters, Ren remained alone with the king for a brief, charged moment, the silence between them heavier now than before, filled with questions neither of them could yet answer. Cale studied her a moment longer, and then, with a small incline of his head that might have been gratitude, or perhaps something closer to relief, he returned to his seat by the window, leaving Ren standing in the middle of the grand chamber, uncertain whether she had just been given an extraordinary honor or pulled into something far more complicated than she had ever imagined possible. She gathered her satchel from the table, her hands trembling slightly, and made her way toward the door, casting one last glance over her shoulder. Cale remained by the window, his gaze once again fixed on whatever lay beyond the glass, but his posture had changed, just slightly, as though some of the weight she had noticed earlier had eased, if only for a moment, if only because a stranger had walked into his silence and had not run from it. Perrin led her to the new chamber himself, walking a few steps ahead the entire way, his silence far less comfortable than the king's had been. It was a small room, plain but clean, with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a single window that looked out over an inner courtyard lined with bare rose bushes waiting for spring. "You will remain within the physician's wing unless summoned," Perrin said, standing stiffly in the doorway. "You will not seek out His Majesty on your own. You will not discuss what happened this morning with the other servants. Do you understand?" "I understand that I am not to speak of it," Ren said. "I do not understand why it happened in the first place." Perrin's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "3 years ago, this palace was a very different place," he said, his voice quieter now that the door was mostly closed behind him. "His Majesty was not always silent. He used to speak in full council meetings, laugh at his brother's jokes during feasts, sing old hunting songs when he thought no one was listening closely enough to hear him. Then the coronation happened, and something in him closed like a door slammed shut in a storm. No physician has managed to open it since." "What happened at the coronation?" Ren asked, though she suspected, from Perrin's tightening jaw, that she had asked the wrong question. "That is not a story for a healer's apprentice on her first full day in the palace," Perrin said, straightening his robes as though to reset the boundaries of the conversation. "Rest now. Tomorrow, you will begin your duties in the ward as planned, unless His Majesty requests otherwise." He paused at the door, glancing back at her with an expression she could not fully read. "For what it is worth, girl, I have served this court for over a decade, and I have never seen him raise his hand to protect anyone, the way he did for you this morning. Whatever you did to earn that, I would advise you to be careful with it." He left before she could ask what he meant, and Ren sat alone on the edge of her new bed, turning his words over in her mind. She had done nothing, as far as she could tell, beyond stumbling into the wrong room at the wrong time, and yet something about the encounter had clearly shifted something within the palace's careful, practiced order, something even the steward seemed uneasy discussing. She spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking her small collection of belongings, arranging her herbs and instruments along the narrow shelf provided, trying to settle into a life that had changed direction so suddenly she barely recognized the shape of it. Through her window, she watched servants cross the courtyard below, their heads bowed, their pace quick, none of them lingering long enough to enjoy the pale afternoon sun. A knock came at her door, just as the light outside began to shift toward evening. She opened it to find a young kitchen maid holding a tray of simple food, her eyes wide with the particular curiosity of someone who had clearly already heard the morning's rumors. "They say the king asked for you by name," the maid whispered, setting the tray down on the small table near the window. "Is it true he raised his hand against Perrin himself?" "I do not know what to make of what happened," Ren admitted honestly, unwilling to add to whatever version of the story had already begun spreading through the palace's lower halls. "No one has heard him make a sound in 3 years," the maid continued, lowering her voice further, as though the walls themselves might report her words. Not a word, not a laugh, not even a cough, loud enough to notice. My mother works in the kitchens, and she says the whole staff prays every night that whatever haunts him never turns its attention toward the rest of us. Do people believe it is a curse? Wren asked. The maid shrugged, though her eyes betrayed genuine unease. Some do. Others say grief can steal a voice just as surely as any curse could. I do not know which frightens me more. Honestly, a spell no one can break, or a sadness so deep that even a king cannot climb out of it. She glanced toward the door, suddenly nervous. I should go before I am missed. Please, eat while the food is still warm. Wren thanked her and ate alone, as the last light faded from her window, her mind circling endlessly around the strange gray eyes she had seen that morning, the raised hand that had silenced a steward without a single word, and the quiet, careful hope that had flickered somewhere behind the king's exhaustion when she had told him her name. Later that evening, as Wren sat in her newly assigned chamber near the physician's ward, Nora arrived with a look of barely contained curiosity. You spent the morning in the king's private chamber, Nora said, not quite a question. I did not choose to, Wren replied honestly. I was brought there by mistake, and then I was told I could not leave. Nora studied her for a long moment, the same careful, measuring look she had given Wren at the village gate. In 3 years, she said slowly, His Majesty has not requested the presence of a single person, outside his most trusted counsel. Not a servant, not a healer, not even the physicians who have tried for years to understand what happened to his voice. Then why me? Wren asked, the question that had followed her since morning finally spoken aloud. Nora's expression softened, though the curiosity in her eyes did not fade. I do not know, she admitted, but I intend to find out. And I suspect, Wren Sable, that you will find out alongside me, whether either of us is prepared for what we discover. 3 days passed before Wren was summoned again, and in that time, she learned the physician's ward the way she had once learned the paths through Ashcomb's forests, by walking them until her feet knew the way without her mind needing to think about it. She assisted Nora with minor injuries among the staff, prepared tinctures for the palace's aging cook, and listened carefully to every conversation that drifted past her, hoping to piece together more of the story Perrin had refused to finish. It was Nora, in the end, who gave her the next piece, though she did so carefully, as if handling something sharp. His Majesty had a brother, Nora said one afternoon, as they ground dried chamomile together at the long work table in the ward. Prince Rydian, 2 years younger, but fierce in a way most people found impossible not to admire. The two of them were inseparable as boys. Was, Wren repeated quietly, catching the tense. Nora's hands stilled over the mortar. He died the night of the coronation. That is all I am permitted to say, and more than I should have said at all. Permitted by whom? By the weight of what happened, Nora said simply, and would not be drawn further, no matter how carefully Wren tried to ask. Later that same afternoon, Wren carried a tray of fresh bandages toward the storage room at the far end of the ward, and nearly collided with Owen, who was leaning against the corridor wall with the relaxed posture of a man who had found a reason to linger somewhere he did not strictly need to be. You survived your first summons then, Owen said, falling into step beside her as she continued down the hall. Barely, Wren admitted. I still do not understand why he wanted me there in the first place. Word travels fast in a place this small, Owen said, lowering his voice. The guards outside the council chamber say Perrin has been unusually quiet since that morning, which for a man who never stops talking, is its own kind of announcement. Something happened in that room, even if none of us know exactly what. Nothing happened, Wren said, though even as she said it, she was not entirely certain it was true. He looked at me. He raised his hand to stop Perrin from removing me. That is all. That is not all, and you know it is not all, Owen said, though not unkindly. In 3 years, no one outside his most trusted counsel has been permitted near him without a wall of guards and a very short list of approved topics. You walked into a room by accident and walked out with a standing invitation. That is not nothing, Wren. Wren did not have an answer for that, and Owen, sensing her discomfort, softened his tone. I do not say this to frighten you, he added. I say it because I think you deserve to understand what you have stepped into, even if none of us fully understand it ourselves. Just be careful who you trust, with what you see and hear inside these walls. Not everyone here wishes the king well. even if they wear the same uniform I do." His words settled over her like a quiet warning she could not yet fully interpret, and she carried them with her for the rest of the day, turning them over even as she resumed her work, grinding herbs, and preparing the evening's remedies alongside Nora. It was into that same uneasy quiet that the summons finally arrived. A guard arrived at the ward with a summons Wren had not expected. His Majesty required her presence in the Eastern Garden before sunset. Nora offered no explanation beyond a knowing look and a gentle push toward the door, telling her only to go, and to be honest with him about whatever he wished to know. The Eastern Garden was unlike anything Wren had seen in the capital so far, a quiet stretch of trimmed hedges and winter blooms tucked behind the physician's wing, shielded from the rest of the palace by high stone walls covered in climbing ivy. Kale stood near a small fountain at its center, his back to her, his hands clasped behind him in a posture that looked more like waiting than command. "Your Majesty," Wren said softly, announcing her presence. He turned, and for the first time since their encounter in his chamber, something close to relief crossed his face, as though he had genuinely wondered whether she would come at all. He gestured toward a stone bench near the fountain, an invitation rather than an order, and Wren sat, watching as he settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the quiet tension radiating from him, though she could not yet name its source. From within his sleeve, he produced a small folded parchment and a piece of charcoal, offering both to her without a word. "You would like to write to me," Wren said, understanding slowly. He nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, and waited. Wren unfolded the parchment and found, to her surprise, that it already held writing, neat and careful, as though prepared in advance rather than composed on the spot. "I am told you set a broken leg without flinching and asked no payment beyond honesty. I would like to know more about the woman who did that, if she is willing to share it." Wren felt something warm bloom in her chest at the simplicity of the request, so different from the fear and formality that had surrounded every other interaction since her arrival. She took the charcoal he offered and wrote her answer beneath his words. "There is little to tell. I am the daughter of a farmer and a weaver. I learned healing from a woman named Agnes, who took me in when I was young and taught me everything I know. I have never traveled farther than the market town nearest my village, until 6 days ago." She handed the parchment back, and Kale read it slowly, his eyes lingering on each line as though committing it to memory. He wrote again, longer this time. "Agnes sounds wise. My own teachers were soldiers and scholars, though I learned more from watching my brother argue with them than from anything they taught directly. He never accepted an answer simply because someone with authority gave it. He wanted to understand the reason behind every rule before he agreed to follow it." "He sounds like he was remarkable," Wren said aloud, unsure whether speaking while he wrote was acceptable, but unable to stop herself. Something flickered across Kale's face at her words, a mixture of grief and gratitude so raw that Wren immediately regretted having spoken. He nodded slowly, then wrote one final line before folding the parchment closed, as though he could not bear to look at his own words any longer. He was. They sat together in silence after that, the fountain's gentle sound filling the space where conversation might have continued under different circumstances. Wren did not press him further, sensing instinctively that whatever memory she had touched required careful handling, the way a wound too fresh could not withstand direct pressure, without causing more harm than good. "I do not need you to explain everything to me," she said eventually, watching the last light of evening catch the water's surface. "I only wanted you to know that I am not afraid of your silence, Your Majesty. Whatever caused it, I imagine it must be a heavier thing to carry than most people around you understand." Kale turned to look at her then, his gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch, and for a moment, Wren was certain he wanted to say something aloud, that the words were forming somewhere behind his closed lips, straining against whatever held them locked away. But nothing came, only a slow exhale, and a small, grateful incline of his head that told her, more clearly than any words could have, that he had heard her, and that it mattered. A rustle of movement near the garden's entrance broke the moment, and both of them turned to see a tall, well-dressed man watching them with narrowed eyes, his expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who had trained himself never to reveal his true thoughts. "Your Majesty," the man said, bowing with practiced elegance, "forgive the intrusion. I did not realize you had company this evening." Kale's posture changed immediately, straightening with something that looked almost like wariness, and Wren felt the warmth of their earlier exchange evaporate under the newcomer's watchful gaze. "Lord Draven," Wren heard Nora's voice explain later that night, when she returned to the ward and recounted the encounter in careful detail. "One of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, and not a man who enjoys surprises, especially ones involving His Majesty's private time." "He did not seem pleased to see me there," Wren said. "He would not be," Nora replied, her voice heavy with implication. "Lord Draven has spent the better part of 2 years positioning his daughter as a future queen, hoping the king's silence would eventually make him easier to guide toward a marriage of convenience. A healer's apprentice sharing quiet conversation with His Majesty in the garden is not a development he will welcome." Wren felt a chill settle over her at the thought, though she could not entirely explain why the idea of Lord Draven's displeasure troubled her as much as it did. She had done nothing wrong, had sought nothing beyond honest conversation with a lonely man who happened to wear a crown. And yet something in Draven's narrowed eyes had suggested that honesty and simplicity were exactly the qualities he found most dangerous. "Should I be worried?" Wren asked. Nora considered the question carefully before answering. "I think," she said slowly, "that you should be careful, which is not quite the same thing as worried. Lord Draven does not act rashly. He watches, and waits, and moves only when he is certain of the outcome. If he has decided you are worth watching, then you have already become more significant to this court than you realize." That night, lying awake in her narrow bed with the folded memory of Cale's handwriting still fresh in her mind, Wren found herself thinking not of the danger Nora had described, but of the words he had written about his brother, the grief that had lived behind his silence for 3 long years, and the quiet, fragile trust he had extended to her in a garden shielded from the rest of the world. Whatever Lord Draven's suspicions might grow into, Wren found she could not bring herself to regret the hour she had spent beside the fountain, watching a king who had forgotten how to speak slowly remember what it felt like to be heard. She rose before dawn the next morning, unable to sleep any longer beneath the weight of everything she had learned, and made her way quietly to the ward to begin her duties early. The corridors were empty at that hour, lit only by the last of the night's candles burning low in their sconces, and Wren found a strange comfort in the silence, so different from the tense, watchful quiet that filled the palace during the day. She used the quiet hour to organize the shelves along the far wall, sorting jars of dried lavender and crushed willow bark by the ailments they treated rather than simply by their names, a system Agnes had taught her years ago that made the difference between a fast, confident remedy and a frantic search through unfamiliar labels during an emergency. It was steady work, the kind that asked nothing of her mind beyond attention, and for a little while, it kept the tangled questions of the last 2 days at a comfortable distance. Nora found her there an hour later, already grinding herbs at the work table, and studied her with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what had kept Wren awake. "You are thinking of Lord Draven," Nora said, settling onto the stool across from her. "I am thinking of all of it," Wren admitted. "The brother who died, the silence that followed, a nobleman who watches me like I am a threat to something I do not even understand. 3 days ago, I was setting a farmer's broken arm in Ashcombe. Now I am apparently important enough to be watched by the most powerful man in the kingdom besides the king himself." "Importance is not always a gift," Nora said gently. "Sometimes it is simply a burden that arrives before you are ready to carry it. But you are stronger than you know, Wren. I saw that the moment you set that rider's leg without hesitation. Whatever this becomes, I do not think you will face it unprepared." Wren wanted to believe her, and for the moment, sitting in the quiet of the early ward with the day's work stretching ahead of her, she allowed herself the small comfort of trying. Outside, the first light of morning had begun to touch the courtyard, chasing the shadows back toward the corners of the palace, and somewhere beyond the ward's walls, in a chamber she had visited only once, Wren wondered whether the king had slept at all, or whether he too had spent the night turning over the same fragile, uncertain hope that had settled between them beside the fountain. A week into her time at the palace, Wren had begun to settle into a rhythm that felt, for the first time since her arrival, almost familiar. Mornings were spent assisting Nora with the ordinary business of the ward, tending to servants with aching backs and cooks with burned hands, and afternoons often carried the quiet anticipation of a possible summons to the Eastern Garden, though such invitations came only every few days, careful and unhurried, as though Cale was testing the strength of something fragile before trusting it fully. It was during one such ordinary morning that Nora asked her to fetch an old ledger of remedies from the archive room below the ward, a task Wren accepted without hesitation, grateful for the chance to move and think after hours spent bent over the work table grinding roots into paste. The old archive room sat beneath the physician's wing, reached by a narrow staircase that Wren had walked past a dozen times without realizing what it led to, until Nora sent her down one afternoon to retrieve a ledger of remedies dating back several decades. The air below was cool and dry, thick with the smell of aging paper, and rows of shelves stretched further into the dark than Wren had expected, filled with boxes and folders that looked as though they had not been disturbed in years. She found the ledger easily enough, but as she turned to leave, a half-open box near the bottom shelf caught her eye, its edges scorched black, as though it had once survived a fire that had not quite finished its work. Curiosity. The same curiosity that had guided her hands toward every unfamiliar remedy since childhood, pulled her closer before she had fully decided to look. Inside, beneath a layer of undamaged papers, she found a stack of documents marked with a wax seal she recognized from the palace gates. The silver wolf pressed into faded red wax. The top page, though scorched at its corners, was still legible, and Wren's breath caught as she began to read. The record described, in careful physician's handwriting, the events of a coronation night 3 years past. It spoke of a succession duel, an ancient custom rarely invoked in modern times, in which two claimants to the throne settled their right to rule through combat, rather than birth order alone. It spoke of Prince Rydian, younger brother to the newly crowned king, challenging the succession not out of malice, the physician had written, but out of a desperate hope that his brother might be spared a crown he had never wanted to wear. Wren's hands trembled as she read further. The duel had not been meant to end in death. Such challenges, the document explained, were traditionally fought with blunted weapons, more ceremony than true combat, decided the moment one combatant yielded. But something had gone wrong that night, a misstep, a moment of confusion in the darkness of the dueling grounds, and the blunted blade meant for ceremony had found an unintended, fatal mark. The physician's account noted, with clinical precision that somehow made the words more devastating, that the new king had not spoken since the moment his brother's body went still in his arms, and had not spoken in the 3 years since, despite every effort by the court's finest healers to determine a physical cause for his silence. There is no wound upon his throat, no illness within his body that we can detect, the physician had written. We suspect the cause lies beyond what medicine alone can heal, though we dare not speak such conclusions openly, for fear of what it would mean for a kingdom that requires its ruler to project strength rather than grief. Wren closed the box carefully, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just learned, understanding now the shape of the shadow that had followed Cale through every silent hour since his coronation. He had not lost his brother to an enemy, or to illness, or to the slow decay of age. He had lost him to his own hand, in a duel meant only for ceremony, a tragedy so cruel in its accident that no wonder his voice had refused to return, as though speaking again might mean accepting a truth too unbearable to hold. She carried both the ledger and the weight of her discovery back up the narrow staircase, her mind turning over the delicate question of what, if anything, she should do with what she now knew. Nora took one look at her face upon her return, and set down her work immediately. "You found something," Nora said, not quite a question. Wren hesitated, then described what she had read, watching Nora's expression shift from curiosity to a somber, careful sorrow that confirmed every detail she had pieced together in the archive's dim light. "I did not know the full account still existed," Nora admitted quietly. "I knew fragments, whispers passed carefully between physicians sworn to discretion, but I had never seen it written so plainly." "Should I tell him I know?" Wren asked. "Or would that only cause him more pain?" Nora considered the question, with the seriousness it deserved. "I cannot answer that for you," she said finally. "But I will say this. A wound left untouched does not heal, simply because no one speaks of it. Sometimes it festers instead, deep beneath the surface, until it finds another way to break free." Wren thought of Cale's raw expression in the garden when she had mentioned his brother, the grief and gratitude tangled together in his eyes, and she understood, with a clarity that settled deep in her chest, that Nora was right. Whatever pain lived behind his silence had been carried alone for 3 long years. Perhaps it was time someone carried it alongside him, even if only for a moment. She did not seek him out that evening, unwilling to force a conversation before she had properly considered how to approach something so fragile. Instead, she spent the night composing her thoughts carefully, the way Agnes had once taught her to approach a difficult diagnosis, gathering every piece of evidence before offering a conclusion that could not be gently unspoken once given voice. She encountered Owen briefly on her way back from the archive that same morning, and though she did not share the specifics of what she had found, he seemed to notice the change in her mood immediately. "You look like someone who has been carrying something heavy," he observed, falling into step beside her. "I have learned something I am not certain how to hold," Wren admitted, "about the king, about what happened before his silence began." Owen's expression grew serious. "Then you understand now why the whole palace treats his quiet the way it does. It is not simple fear of a curse, Wren. It is the fear of standing near a grief so large that none of us know how to help carry it." He paused, studying her carefully. "Do you intend to tell him you know?" "I do not know yet," Wren said honestly. "I am afraid of causing him more pain, but I am also afraid of what it costs him to keep carrying it entirely alone." "For what it is worth," Owen said, "I think you might be the first person in 3 years who has cared more about easing his burden than about managing the political consequences of his silence. That has to count for something." His words stayed with her through the rest of the day, echoing alongside Nora's earlier counsel as she weighed the delicate question of what to do with the truth she now carried. By the time evening approached, she had made her decision, though her heart still pounded with uncertainty as she waited to see whether the summons she hoped for would arrive at all. The summons came the following afternoon, delivered by a guard who no longer seemed surprised to find himself fetching a healer's apprentice for the king's private company. Wren followed him to the eastern garden once more, her heart steady, despite the uncertainty pressing against her chest. Kale sat near the fountain as before, and this time, when he saw her approaching, something in his posture eased immediately, as though her presence alone had already begun to lift some portion of the weight he carried. He gestured for her to sit, and produced the familiar parchment and charcoal, but Wren shook her head gently before he could begin writing. "I found something in the archive yesterday," she said carefully. "I was not looking for it, but once I saw it, I could not stop myself from reading. I know what happened the night of your coronation, Your Majesty. I know about your brother." Kale went very still, his gray eyes searching her face for a long, silent moment, and Wren held his gaze without flinching, refusing to let her own fear of overstepping outweigh the honesty she believed he deserved. "I am not telling you this to cause you pain," she continued softly. "I am telling you because I do not think you should have to carry something so heavy entirely alone, not anymore. Whatever happened that night, it was an accident, a tragedy born from a broken moment, not from any cruelty in your heart. I do not believe, for even a moment, that you meant for it to happen." For a long time, Kale said nothing, his jaw tight, his hands clenched against his knees, as though physically restraining something that wanted desperately to break free. Then, slowly, his shoulders began to shake, and Wren watched, her chest aching with a sympathy too large for words, as tears fell silently down the face of a king who had never once, in 3 long years, allowed himself to be seen breaking. She did not reach for him, sensing instinctively that he needed the space to feel what he felt without interruption, but she remained close, a steady, quiet presence beside him, as the fountain's gentle sound filled the space where his voice still refused to go. When his tears finally slowed, he lifted his head and looked at her with an expression so raw and grateful that Wren felt her own eyes sting in response. He reached for the parchment then, his hand trembling slightly, as he wrote a single line, shorter than anything he had written before, but heavier, somehow, than all the words that had come previously. "Thank you for not looking away." Wren took his hand gently, the first time she had touched him beyond the careful distance of their earlier exchanges, and felt him grip her fingers with a quiet desperation that told her, more clearly than any written words could have, exactly how alone he had been, and how much it had cost him to let someone finally see the truth he had hidden, even from himself. "I am not going anywhere," she said softly, and meant it with a certainty that surprised her, given how recently her entire world had changed. "Whatever comes next, Your Majesty, you do not have to face it in silence alone." They remained there together as the evening light faded into deep blue dusk, 2 people bound now by a truth too heavy for either of them to carry easily alone, but somehow, in the sharing of it, made just slightly more bearable than it had been the day before. When Wren finally rose to return to the ward, Cale walked with her as far as the garden gate, an unspoken gesture that surprised the guards stationed nearby, who exchanged quick, uncertain glances before schooling their expressions back into practiced neutrality. At the threshold, he paused and wrote one final note before letting her go, his hand steadier now than it had been throughout the whole encounter. I have not spoken his name aloud since that night. I do not know if I ever will again, but it helps, somehow, that you know it now too, and that I do not have to be the only one who remembers him. I will remember him with you, Wren said simply, for as long as you wish it. He nodded, folding the parchment carefully, as though it were something precious, rather than a simple scrap of paper, and Wren walked back toward the ward, with a lightness in her chest that she had not expected to feel after carrying such heavy news. It was not happiness exactly, not yet, but it was something close to hope, the quiet, fragile kind that grows slowly after a long season of grief, uncertain of its own right to exist, but growing nonetheless. Nora was waiting for her when she returned, and though she asked no questions, the look she gave Wren upon seeing her face told her that whatever had passed between them in the garden that evening had not gone unnoticed, even from a distance. You told him, Nora said quietly. I told him, Wren confirmed, and I think, for the first time in 3 years, he let himself grieve in front of someone instead of alone. Nora's eyes softened with something that looked almost like pride. Then you have done something none of the rest of us managed in all that time, she said. Rest now, Wren. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges soon enough, and you have earned tonight's peace. Word of the garden meeting spread through the palace faster than Wren could have anticipated, carried not through open gossip, which the staff still feared too much to risk, but through the quieter language of glances and small courtesies that shifted in her direction as the days passed. Servants who had once looked through her now offered small nods of acknowledgement. Guards who had questioned her presence in certain corridors now stepped aside without comment. It was as though the entire palace had collectively decided, without a single word spoken aloud, that whatever was happening between the silent king and the healer's apprentice deserved careful respect rather than casual interference. Cale's summons came more frequently now, sometimes twice within the same week, and their conversations in the Eastern Garden grew longer, less bound by careful formality and more comfortable with silence itself, the kind of silence that did not need filling because the understanding between them had already grown deep enough to hold it. You have taught me something, Wren told him one evening, as they walked slowly along the garden's outer path, the winter roses casting long shadows in the fading light. I used to think silence meant absence, that a person who did not speak had nothing left to say. But you have shown me that silence can hold entire conversations, if two people are patient enough to listen for them. Cale glanced at her, something warm and unguarded in his expression, and reached for the parchment tucked into his sleeve. You listen better than anyone I have known, he wrote. Even before I lost my voice, I do not think anyone listened to me the way you do now. Perhaps that is because most people are too busy waiting for their turn to speak, Wren said. I learned early, from Agnes, that healing often requires more listening than talking. A patient will tell you what is wrong with them, if you are patient enough to notice the details they do not think to mention directly. He smiled at that, a small, genuine expression that had become less rare with each visit, and Wren felt her chest warm at the sight of it, a feeling she had begun, cautiously, to recognize as something deeper than simple friendship or professional care. Not every consequence of the palace's growing awareness was gentle. 3 days earlier, a senior court noble named Lord Hollis had approached Nora directly, demanding that Wren be reassigned to duties outside the capital entirely, citing concerns that a healer's apprentice of such low birth had no place occupying so much of the king's private attention. Nora had refused him firmly, reminding him that assignments within the physician's wing fell under her authority alone, but the confrontation had left Wren shaken for the better part of a day. He does not know me, Wren had said to Nora afterward, still trying to steady her breathing. He has decided I am a problem, without ever exchanging a single word with me. That is precisely the danger, Nora had replied. Men like Hollis do not need to know you to fear what you represent. A king who has been silent and pliable for 3 years, suddenly showing warmth towards someone outside their control, threatens every careful arrangement they have built around his silence. You do not have to have done anything wrong to be seen as a threat, Ren. Sometimes simply existing in the wrong place is enough. Ren had carried that warning with her in the days since, watching the court with a wariness she had not needed before, noting which nobles offered polite nods, and which ones looked through her as though she did not exist at all. It was with that same caution that she walked beside Cale through the garden this particular evening, grateful for the quiet reprieve his company offered from the tension building slowly around her, in every other corner of the palace. Their walk was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path, and both of them turned to see a young noblewoman approaching, dressed in fine violet silk that marked her as someone of considerable standing. She stopped a respectful distance away, though her eyes lingered on Ren, with an expression that held more curiosity than hostility. "Your Majesty," she said, offering a graceful curtsy. "Forgive my intrusion. I did not mean to interrupt." Cale's posture straightened slightly, though not with the wariness Ren had seen when Lord Draven appeared. He inclined his head toward the young woman in acknowledgement, and Ren recognized, from the shape of her features, an unmistakable resemblance to the noble who had watched them so carefully in this same garden days before. "You must be Lady Elena," Ren said, before she could stop herself, remembering Nora's description of Lord Draven's daughter. The young woman's eyes widened slightly, surprised to be recognized. "I am. And you must be the healer everyone has been discussing." She studied Ren with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between assessment and genuine interest. "My father speaks of you often, though not always kindly. I imagine he has reasons of his own for that," Ren said carefully, unsure how much honesty was safe in this conversation. Elena's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "My father has spent 2 years hoping His Majesty's silence would make him more easily guided toward a marriage he believes would strengthen the kingdom. I confess, watching you these past weeks, I do not think that hope was ever particularly realistic, silence or not." She glanced toward Cale, something gentler in her expression now. "For what it is worth, Your Majesty, I have never wished for a marriage I did not choose myself. Whatever my father's ambitions, they were never entirely mine." Cale studied her for a long moment, then wrote a brief note and held it toward her rather than Ren. Elena read it, and something in her posture eased, as though a weight she had carried for a long time had been quietly acknowledged and set aside. "Thank you," she said softly. And then, with a final glance toward Ren that held something almost like solidarity, she curtsied once more and disappeared back down the garden path. "What did you write to her?" Ren asked, once they were alone again. Cale took up the parchment once more, his charcoal moving in quick, decisive strokes. "I told her that no marriage born from her father's ambition would ever be one I would choose either, and that she deserves the same freedom to choose her own path that I hope to reclaim for myself." Ren felt something tighten pleasantly in her chest at his words, though she was careful not to read too much into what he might mean by reclaiming his own path. Still, the exchange left her with a lighter heart than she had expected, understanding now that whatever tension existed between the king and Lord Draven's ambitions, it did not necessarily extend to the daughter caught in the middle of it. They continued their walk as dusk settled fully over the garden, the conversation drifting into easier territory. Stories of Ren's childhood in Ashcombe, memories Cale shared through careful, patient writing about hunting trips with his brother, before the weight of succession had settled over their relationship. It was, Ren thought, the closest thing to an ordinary evening she had experienced since arriving at the palace, 2 people simply enjoying each other's company, without the constant shadow of politics and fear pressing down around them. As they neared the garden's entrance to part ways for the evening, Cale stopped suddenly, his expression shifting into something more serious. He wrote quickly, his hand less steady than before. "I do not know what this is between us, but I do not want it to end simply because I am afraid to name it. Would you allow me the chance to understand what I am feeling, without either of us rushing toward conclusions neither of us is ready for?" Ren read the words twice, her heart pounding steadily beneath her ribs, and found, when she looked up at him, that she did not need to search for an answer. It had already settled somewhere within her, quiet and certain, over the past several weeks of careful glances and shared silences. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "Whatever this becomes, Your Majesty, I do not think either of us needs to rush it. Some things are worth taking the time to understand properly." He reached for her hand then, gently, the way he had once before in the depths of shared grief, but this time the touch carried something different, warmer, filled with a fragile hope. Neither of them dared to speak aloud just yet. They stood together at the garden's threshold, as the first stars emerged overhead. Two people, slowly, carefully, learning to trust something neither of them had expected to find. In a palace that had spent 3 long years, believing its king incapable of feeling anything at all, beyond the silent weight of his grief. The following morning brought a test of that fragile trust sooner than Wren expected. She was summoned to the council antechamber, where Lord Hollis waited alongside 2 other nobles, their expressions carefully arranged into looks of polite concern that did nothing to disguise the coldness beneath. "We understand you have been spending considerable time in His Majesty's private company," Hollis said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "The council wishes to remind you that such access is a privilege, not a right, and privileges extended carelessly can just as easily be withdrawn." "I have not sought access beyond what His Majesty himself has requested," Wren replied carefully, keeping her voice steady, despite the tightness gathering in her chest. "Perhaps not," Hollis said, "but a girl of your station, occupying so much of the king's attention, raises questions the council cannot simply ignore. Questions of influence, of intent, of whether a healer's apprentice understands the weight of what she is being permitted to witness." Before Wren could answer, the antechamber door opened, and Cale entered without announcement, his presence immediately silencing the room in a way that no spoken command could have achieved more thoroughly. He crossed to stand beside Wren, close enough that the message was unmistakable to everyone present, and fixed Hollis with a stare that carried 3 years of restrained authority behind it. Hollis paled slightly but held his ground. "Your Majesty, we meant no disrespect. We simply wished to clarify the young woman's position within the court." Cale reached for the parchment he now carried everywhere, and wrote a single line, holding it up for the entire room to see, rather than passing it quietly, as he usually did with Wren alone. "Her position is decided by me, and by no one else in this room." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of Hollis stepping back, his earlier confidence entirely drained away. Cale lowered the parchment, took Wren's hand gently in front of the assembled nobles, an act more declarative than any words could have been, and led her from the antechamber without a backward glance toward the men left standing in stunned, uncertain silence behind them. "You did not need to do that," Wren said quietly once they were alone in the corridor, though her heart still raced from the encounter. Cale turned to her, his expression fierce with a protectiveness she had not fully seen from him before, and wrote quickly on the parchment still clutched in his free hand. "I have let this court dictate too much for too long. I will not let them dictate this." Wren studied the words, then studied him, seeing in his tightened jaw and steady gaze a man who had spent 3 years letting his silence be interpreted however others found convenient, and who had, in the span of a single morning, decided he was done allowing that interpretation to extend to the one part of his life that finally felt like his own. "Lord Hollis will not let this go quietly," she said. "Men who lose face in front of a full council rarely do." Cale nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words without letting them shake his resolve, and wrote a final line before tucking the parchment away. "Then we will face whatever comes next together, the same way we have faced everything else since the day you arrived." They walked the rest of the corridor in comfortable silence, and though Wren could still feel the weight of Hollis's cold stare lingering somewhere behind her, she found she could not bring herself to regret a single moment of what had just happened. Whatever storm Lord Hollis and men like him intended to raise in the days ahead, she understood now that she would not face it as an outsider stumbling through an unfamiliar palace. She would face it standing beside a king who had finally, after 3 long years, found something worth breaking his careful, guarded distance for. Lord Draven did not visit the Eastern Garden again after the encounter that had first introduced him to Wren, but his absence proved far less comforting than she had hoped. Instead, his presence made itself known through quieter channels, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, sideways glances from servants who had once been friendly, and a growing sense that something was being carefully arranged just beyond her ability to see it clearly. Nora noticed the shift as well, and one evening, after the ward had emptied of its usual patients, she sat Wren down with an expression more serious than Wren had seen from her since their first meeting at the village gate. "Lord Draven has called a private meeting with several members of the council," Nora said. "I was not invited, which tells me a great deal on its own, but one of the junior physicians overheard enough to piece together the shape of it." "What is he planning?" Wren asked, her stomach tightening. He intends to suggest, formally, that your presence in the palace poses a security risk, Nora said. He will argue that a healer's apprentice, with no established loyalty to the crown, arriving so suddenly and gaining such unprecedented access to His Majesty, warrants investigation. He may even suggest, carefully and without direct accusation, that you could be working on behalf of a rival territory, using whatever influence you have gained to weaken the kingdom from within. Ren felt the blood drain from her face. That is absurd. I have done nothing but tend to the sick and spend time with a lonely man who happens to wear a crown. I know that, Nora said gently, and I suspect, deep down, so does Lord Draven. But the truth rarely matters as much as the story that can be told convincingly to frightened people. He does not need proof, Ren. He only needs enough doubt to justify removing you before his ambitions for his daughter are permanently lost. Ren spent that night awake, staring at the ceiling of her small chamber, turning over every possible response to a threat she had no experience navigating. In Ashcombe, the worst danger she had faced was an illness resistant to treatment, or a difficult birth that tested every skill Agnes had taught her. She had never before needed to defend her own presence, her own honesty, against the calculated maneuvering of a powerful man, determined to see her gone. On the morning the summons to the council session arrived, Ren found Lady Elena waiting for her outside the physician's ward, her violet silks replaced by a plainer gray gown, as though she had dressed deliberately to avoid drawing attention to herself. I heard what my father intends to say today, Elena said quietly, glancing over her shoulder, to make certain they were not overheard. I wanted you to know, before you walk into that hall, that not everyone in this court shares his suspicion of you. Thank you, Ren said, genuinely grateful for the small kindness. I confess I do not know what to expect once I am standing in front of the full council. Do not let his confidence frighten you, Elena advised. My father speaks as though he has already won every argument before he begins it. It is a tactic, nothing more. He is skilled at making doubt sound like certainty, but the moment someone refuses to be intimidated by his tone, his arguments often prove far weaker than they first appear. Why are you telling me this? Ren asked. You are his daughter. Surely his ambitions serve your interests as much as his own. Elena's expression grew distant for a moment, touched by something that looked like old, familiar sadness. My father has spent my entire life deciding what serves my interests without ever asking me directly, she said. I would rather see the king find happiness with someone who was chosen freely than watch him forced into a marriage neither of us actually wants. Whatever comes of today, Ren, I hope you know that my father's ambitions were never truly mine. Ren thanked her again, and the two women parted ways, Elena disappearing down a side corridor before the wider court could notice their conversation. The brief exchange did little to calm the anxious knot in Ren's stomach, but it offered something she had not expected to find that morning, a reminder that even within a family determined to see her fail, there existed at least one voice, quietly hoping for a different outcome. The formal accusation came 3 days later, during a full council session that Ren was summoned to attend for the first time since her arrival. She stood at the edge of the grand hall, her hands clasped tightly to stop their trembling, as Lord Draven addressed the assembled nobles with the smooth, practiced confidence of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of persuasion. I do not accuse the girl of malice, Draven said, his voice carrying easily through the hall's high stone ceiling. I accuse only the circumstances surrounding her arrival, circumstances that any reasonable counsel must examine before allowing them to continue unchecked. A girl of unknown loyalty, granted unprecedented access to His Majesty's private company within days of her arrival. Is this not, at minimum, worthy of careful review? Murmurs rippled through the hall, some nobles nodding in cautious agreement, others glancing uncertainly toward the throne where Kale sat, his expression unreadable, his hands still. Ren felt every eye in the room settle on her, weighing her worth against Draven's carefully constructed doubt. I have served the crown for many years, Draven continued, and I have watched His Majesty carry a burden none of us could fully understand. I do not wish to see that burden exploited by anyone, regardless of their intentions, however innocent they may appear. Ren felt the accusation settle over her like a physical weight, and though every instinct urged her to remain silent, to let Kale or Nora speak on her behalf, something in her refused to accept the role of a passive accused, waiting quietly for judgment from men who had never bothered to know her at all. May I speak, Your Majesty? she asked, her voice carrying further than she expected in the sudden quiet of the hall. Cale's eyes found hers, and after a moment's hesitation, he nodded, granting permission with a small gesture that silenced any objection before it could form. Wren stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her voice steadier than she had dared hope. Lord Draven speaks of unknown loyalty, she said. I will not pretend to understand the politics of this court, nor the weight of the crown I have only recently come to know. But I can tell you plainly what I do understand. I understand a broken leg, and how to set it before the swelling makes healing impossible. I understand a fever, and how to break it before it takes a life. And I understand grief, Lord Draven, because I have sat beside a king who carried his alone for 3 years, and I have watched what happens when that grief is finally allowed to breathe instead of being smothered beneath silence and suspicion. She turned to address the wider hall now, her voice growing steadier with each word. I did not come to this palace seeking influence or position. I came because a physician believed my hands were steady enough to be useful, and I have tried, every day since, to be exactly that. If caring about someone's suffering, and trying to ease it honestly, makes me a threat in the eyes of this council, then I confess I do not fully understand what this court believes loyalty should look like. The hall fell into a heavy silence following her words, broken only when Cale rose slowly from his throne, his presence commanding immediate attention, even without a single spoken word. He crossed to stand beside Wren, and produced, for the first time in front of the entire assembled council, the familiar parchment he usually reserved for private conversations. He wrote quickly, then turned the parchment outward for the hall to see, his handwriting bold and deliberate. This woman has given me back more of myself in a few short weeks than 3 years of careful court management ever managed. Any accusation against her character is an accusation against my own judgment, and I will not accept it lightly. The hall remained silent, stunned by the directness of the declaration, and Lord Draven's confident expression faltered for the first time since he had begun speaking. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, seeming to recognize, perhaps for the first time, that whatever ground he had hoped to gain against Wren had just been decisively lost in front of witnesses who would not soon forget what they had seen. Your Majesty, Draven said carefully, I meant only to raise a legitimate concern for the council's consideration. I did not intend to question your judgment directly. Cale's expression remained unmoved, and he wrote one final line before returning to his throne, leaving the parchment held aloft long enough for every noble in the hall to read it clearly. Then let the record show that the concern has been considered and dismissed. The council session ended shortly after, the matter of Wren's presence formally closed, though the tension between Draven and the throne remained thick in the air as nobles filed slowly from the hall, whispering among themselves in tones too low for Wren to fully decipher. She caught Draven's eye briefly as she turned to leave, and found in his expression not defeat, but a calculating patience that told her the matter was far from truly finished, merely delayed, until he found a subtler path toward the same ambition. That evening, in the quiet of the eastern garden, Cale took her hand and held it for a long moment before reaching for his parchment. I am sorry you had to face that alone, he wrote. I should have spoken sooner. You spoke exactly when it mattered most, Wren said softly. That is enough for me. But even as she said it, she could not fully shake the image of Lord Draven's calculating patience, and she understood, with a certainty that settled uneasily in her chest, that whatever peace they had found tonight was only a pause, not an ending, in the battle that had quietly begun the moment she first walked into the king's private chamber. Nora found her later that night, still awake in the ward long after the rest of the staff had retired, and settled quietly beside her at the work table. You handled yourself well today, Nora said. Better than most nobles twice your age manage when facing a hall full of skeptical faces. I did not feel steady, Wren admitted. My hands were shaking the entire time. Steadiness is not the absence of fear, Nora said. It is choosing to speak clearly despite it. I have watched physicians freeze entirely, in far less pressure than what you face today. She studied Wren carefully. Lord Draven will not forget what happened in that hall. Men like him rarely forgive being outmaneuvered in front of witnesses. I know, Wren said quietly. I saw it in his eyes as he left. Then be careful, Nora said, her voice gentle but firm. Not fearful, but careful. There is an important difference between the two, and I think you have already begun to understand it. Wren nodded, grateful for the older woman's steady presence, and the two of them sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the ward quiet around them, the palace beyond its walls settling slowly into the uneasy rest of a court that had witnessed, that day, the first real challenge to its careful, long-standing order. Before returning to her own chamber, Wren stopped by the narrow window at the end of the ward's corridor, looking out over the sleeping city beyond the palace walls. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of council halls and careful political maneuvering, ordinary people were living ordinary lives, unaware of the quiet war being waged inside the palace over the fate of a silent king and the healer who had unexpectedly become tangled in his story. She thought of Agnes, of the simple, steady rhythm of her old life in Ashcombe, and wondered, not for the first time, whether she had been prepared for any of what had followed her arrival here. And yet, even with Lord Draven's cold patience still fresh in her mind, even with the uncertain road ahead pressing at the edges of her thoughts, Wren found she could not bring herself to wish for a return to that simpler life. Something had changed in her since the day she set that rider's broken leg outside Ashcombe's gates, something that went deeper than the palace's grand halls, or the danger gathering slowly within them. She had found a purpose here that felt larger than herself, tied to a man who had spent 3 years believing himself beyond saving, and she was not ready, not yet, to walk away from whatever came next. The weeks following the council session settled into an uneasy calm, the kind that Wren had learned, even in her short time at the palace, never truly meant safety, only patience. Lord Draven made no further public accusations, but his absence from direct confrontation felt less like retreat and more like recalculation, a predator choosing its next approach with greater care after the first attempt had failed. Cale's voice remained silent, but everything else about him had begun to shift in ways the court could not help but notice. He attended council sessions with more visible engagement, responding to reports with decisive written instructions, rather than the distracted silence he had offered for years. He walked the palace corridors with a straighter posture, met the eyes of his guards and servants rather than looking through them, and though he still could not speak, something in his bearing suggested a man slowly remembering how to lead, rather than merely occupy a throne. Wren noticed the change most clearly during a private evening in the garden, when Cale arrived not with his usual careful, measured pace, but with something almost like urgency in his steps. "Is something wrong?" she asked, immediately concerned by the tension in his shoulders. He shook his head, then reconsidered, and reached for his parchment. "Not wrong," he wrote, "but there is a matter I have been avoiding, and I do not think I can avoid it any longer." "What matter?" Wren asked gently, settling onto the bench beside him. Cale hesitated, his charcoal hovering over the parchment for a long moment before he finally began to write, his handwriting less steady than usual. "The old law of succession states that a ruler who cannot speak cannot formally address the full assembly of border territories during the Winter Tribute Council. It has never been tested before, because no ruler has gone silent this long. Lord Draven intends to raise the question formally next month, arguing that my inability to speak disqualifies me from continuing to hold the throne without a regent appointed in my place." Wren felt the ground shift beneath her, understanding immediately the danger buried within this new revelation. "He would use your silence itself as a weapon," she said slowly, "not through accusation against me, but through the law directly." Cale nodded grimly, and if the council votes to require a regent, that regent, by tradition, would be selected from among the senior nobles most aligned with the crown's current interests. Lord Draven has spent 2 years positioning himself precisely for such a role. "Then we cannot let it come to a vote," Wren said, her mind already racing through possibilities, the way it once raced through treatments for a difficult illness. "Is there truly no way for you to speak, even briefly? Even a single word might be enough to satisfy the law's requirement." Owen found her the next morning in the ward, his expression grave in a way she had not seen from him before. He glanced around to make certain they were alone before speaking. "You have heard, then," he said, "about the Winter Tribute Council." "Cale told me himself." Owen nodded slowly. "The guards who serve near the council chambers have been talking. Lord Draven has already begun quietly building support among the border nobles, reminding them of old grievances, old fears about a kingdom led by a silent king. He is careful never to state his intentions directly, but everyone who has served this court long enough can read the shape of what he is building." "How much support does he already have?" Ren asked, dread settling deeper into her stomach. Enough to make the vote closer than anyone would like, Owen admitted. Not enough to guarantee his success, not yet, but enough that His Majesty cannot simply ignore the threat and hope it passes. He studied her carefully. Is there truly no way for him to speak, even for a moment? The law only requires a single word addressed to the assembly, from what I understand. I do not know, Ren said honestly, but I intend to find out whatever I can, however I can. Owen's expression softened slightly at her determination. For what it is worth, Ren, I do not think anyone in this palace has fought harder for him than you have these past weeks. Whatever happens at that council, I do not think it will be for lack of trying on your part. His words offered small comfort, but comfort nonetheless, and Ren carried them with her as she returned to her research, determined to uncover whatever path might lead Cale back toward the voice that had abandoned him on the worst night of his life. Cale's expression grew heavy, and he wrote his answer slowly, as though each word cost him something to admit. I do not know if I am able to. I have tried, many times, in the quiet of my own chamber, when no one was watching. My throat produces nothing, no sound, no whisper, nothing but silence, no matter how desperately I try to force the words free. Ren reached for his hand, holding it firmly, and studied his face with the careful attention she had once given to physical wounds, searching now for something less visible but no less real. Perhaps the problem was never your throat, she said slowly. Perhaps it has always been something deeper, something that no physician's examination could ever hope to find, because it is not the body's silence you are fighting, but your own grief refusing to let go. Understanding the cause has not yet given me the power to overcome it. Then we will find a way together, Ren said firmly. You have carried this silence alone for 3 years, believing it was simply something that happened to you, a wound with no explanation. But I do not believe silence like yours simply exists without reason forever. Grief changes, it moves. Sometimes it only needs the right moment, the right reason, to finally let go of what it has been holding on to. Cale studied her for a long moment, something fragile and hopeful flickering behind his exhausted eyes, and then he nodded, slowly, as though allowing himself, for the first time in years, to believe that recovery might genuinely be possible, rather than a comfort offered simply to ease his suffering. Over the following days, Ren threw herself into research with the same intensity she had once given to mastering Agnes's most difficult remedies, returning to the scorched archive documents, questioning Nora about grief and its physical manifestations, even sending a careful letter to Agnes herself, asking whether the old woman had ever encountered a case of voice loss born purely from emotional trauma, rather than physical injury. Agnes's response arrived within the week, her familiar handwriting steady despite the distance it had traveled. She wrote of an old shepherd in a neighboring village, who had lost his voice after watching his own son drown in a flooded river. A silence that had lasted nearly 2 years before finally breaking, not through any medicine or treatment, but through a moment of pure, uncontrolled emotion that overwhelmed whatever internal barrier had held his voice locked away. The body remembers what the mind refuses to accept, Agnes had written. Sometimes healing does not come from careful, measured effort, but from a moment so overwhelming that the walls we have built simply cannot hold against it any longer. Be patient with him, Ren, and be ready when that moment comes, because it may arrive without warning, and it may frighten him as much as it heals him. Ren shared the letter with Cale that evening, watching him read Agnes's words with an expression of cautious, uncertain hope. He looked up at her once he finished, his gray eyes searching her face for reassurance she was not entirely certain she could offer honestly. I do not know when that moment will come, she admitted. I do not know when we'll finally break through 3 years of silence, but I believe it will come, Cale. I believe your voice is still there, waiting for the right reason to return. It was the first time she had used his name without the formal title attached, and something in his expression shifted at the sound of it, subtle but unmistakable, as though hearing himself addressed simply as a man, rather than a king, had touched something long buried beneath the weight of his crown. He reached for his parchment one final time that evening, his hand steadier than it had been throughout their entire conversation. Say it again, he wrote. Cale, Ren said softly, watching the word land somewhere deep within him, watching his shoulders ease slightly, watching hope settle more firmly into the space where exhausted resignation had lived for so long. Whatever comes, Whatever Lord Draven tries next, whatever this silence still demands of you, I do not believe you will face it alone. Not while I am here." He nodded, unable to answer aloud, but the gratitude in his eyes spoke clearly enough, a promise neither of them needed words to understand, carried instead, in the warmth of his hand, tightening gently around hers, as the evening settled fully into night around the quiet garden that had become, for both of them, the one place in the entire palace where truth was allowed to exist without fear. Ren returned to the ward that night, still turning Agnes's letter over in her mind, and found Nora waiting for her, having clearly been informed already of the situation, through channels of her own. "You believe the shepherd's story holds the answer," Nora said, more observation than question. "I believe it holds a possibility," Ren said. Agnes says his voice returned only when overwhelmed by a moment too powerful to resist. "I do not know what such a moment might look like for Kale, or whether we can create the conditions for it deliberately, or whether it must simply arrive on its own." Nora considered this carefully. "In my years treating this court, I have seen grief take many forms," she said. "Some griefs soften slowly, worn down like a stone beneath years of gentle water. Others break suddenly, all at once, usually in moments of fear or love so intense that the mind no longer has room to maintain its careful defenses." She studied Ren closely. "You have already given him more of the second kind of moment than anyone else has managed in 3 years. Perhaps you underestimate how close you may already be to whatever threshold his silence requires." "I do not want to force something so delicate," Ren said. "If his voice returns, I want it to be because he is ready, not because I pushed him toward a moment he was not prepared for." "That is precisely why you are the right person to help him," Nora said gently. "Anyone else in this palace would have tried to force the issue for their own advantage by now. You have shown nothing but patience, even when patience cost you dearly in that council hall. Trust that patience a little longer, Ren. I believe it will serve you both better than urgency ever could." Ren nodded, comforted slightly by the older woman's steady counsel, though the weight of the coming winter tribute council still pressed heavily against her thoughts, as she finally retired for the night, her mind restless with possibilities she could not yet fully shape into a plan, but determined nonetheless to find whatever path might lead Kale back to the voice he had lost on the worst night of his life, before Lord Draven's careful maneuvering could take from him everything that voice was meant to protect. Sleep did not come easily that night. Ren lay awake long after the ward's candles had burned low, listening to the distant sounds of the palace settling into its uneasy rest, and found herself thinking not of strategies or council votes, but simply of Kale's face when she had said his name aloud for the first time. The small, unguarded flicker of something like relief that had crossed his features, as though the sound of his own name spoken without formality had reminded him, if only for a moment, that he was still a man beneath the crown, still capable of being known, rather than merely obeyed. Whatever the Winter Tribute Council brought, she resolved silently in the dark quiet of her chamber. She would not let Lord Draven reduce that man to nothing more than a symbol, to be argued over and discarded. The horn sounded before dawn, its low, urgent call tearing through the palace's sleeping quiet, and jolting Ren from her bed, before she had even fully registered what the sound meant. She reached the ward's corridor already dressed, her satchel of remedies gathered from habit alone, and found Nora already moving with brisk efficiency, gathering bandages and healing supplies with the practiced speed of someone who had answered such calls before. Ren asked, falling into step beside her. "The eastern border," Nora said grimly. "A raiding force struck the outpost near Thornfield before first light. The wounded are being brought in now. Whatever training you have had, Ren, you will need all of it today." The physician's ward transformed within the hour into a scene of controlled chaos. Wounded warriors carried in on stretchers, their injuries ranging from minor cuts to wounds that made Ren's stomach twist with the memory of every difficult case Agnes had ever walked her through. She worked without pause, cleaning wounds, setting bones, applying pressure to injuries that would not stop bleeding, her mind narrowing entirely to the immediate demands of each patient in front of her, leaving no room for fear or exhaustion to intrude. It was well into the chaos of the morning that she learned the fuller shape of what had happened. The raiding force had not been ordinary bandits or opportunistic border raiders, but organized fighters, bearing the old markings of Prince Rydian's former supporters, exiled remnants of a faction that had never accepted Kale's claim to the throne, resurfacing now, with a boldness that suggested they believed the kingdom's current instability offered an opportunity too valuable to ignore. They timed this deliberately. Ren overheard one wounded soldier tell another, as she worked to stitch a gash along his forearm. They knew about the Winter Tribute Council. They knew the throne looks weaker now than it has in years, thanks to Lord Draven's endless maneuvering. They are testing whether Veyrath can still defend itself, or whether it has grown too fractured to respond. The words settled into Ren's chest like ice, understanding immediately how deeply the political games playing out in the palace's grand halls had begun to bleed into the safety of the kingdom's actual borders. Whatever Lord Draven believed he was achieving through careful accusations and quiet alliances, the consequences of that instability were now arriving in the physician's ward, in the form of broken bodies and desperate, frightened soldiers. She had no time to dwell further on the thought before a second wave of wounded arrived, this time carrying word that the fighting had not remained contained to the initial outpost. The raiders had pushed further into Veyrath's territory than expected, and a defensive line had formed near a smaller village not far from the capital itself, a village that, Ren realized with a jolt of horror, lay directly along the route the Eastern Garden's outer wall bordered, close enough that the sounds of distant conflict might soon become audible even within the palace grounds. Cale arrived at the ward himself sometime past midday, dressed not in his usual simple chamber clothing but in armor that Ren had never seen him wear, his expression set with a grim determination that reminded her, for the first time since her arrival, that beneath his silence and his grief, he was still a warrior trained to lead armies, not merely occupy a throne. He found her immediately amid the chaos, and though he could not speak, the urgency in his gestures communicated clearly enough. He needed healers at the forward position, close enough to treat the wounded before the journey back to the capital worsened their injuries beyond saving. "I will go," Ren said immediately, already gathering her supplies. Nora caught her arm before she could move further. "It is dangerous beyond the palace walls today, Ren. You do not have to volunteer for this." "Soldiers are dying because the nearest healers are too far away," Ren said firmly. "I did not train for years under Agnes simply to stay safely behind walls while people who need me suffer for the distance. I am going." Cale studied her for a long moment, something fierce and protective warring visibly behind his eyes, but he did not argue against her decision, perhaps understanding, better than anyone, the particular stubbornness of someone who could not stand by, while others suffered needlessly. He gestured for a contingent of guards to accompany her, and within the hour, Ren found herself riding toward the sound of distant conflict, her heart pounding steadily beneath a fear she refused to let slow her hands. The forward position, when she reached it, was every bit as chaotic as she had feared. Wounded soldiers gathered beneath makeshift shelters, the sounds of ongoing skirmishes still audible from beyond a nearby ridge. Ren threw herself into the work immediately, treating wound after wound with the same steady focus that had carried her through the morning's chaos in the ward, losing track of time entirely as the afternoon wore on. It was during a lull in the wounded's arrival that she first heard the shout of alarm from the ridge above, followed immediately by the sound of hooves and shouting voices closing in far too quickly for comfort. A small group of raiders, having broken through the main defensive line, had circled toward the forward position itself, seeking to disrupt the treatment of wounded soldiers and sow further chaos among Veyrath's forces. Ren froze for only a moment before instinct took over, pulling a wounded soldier back from the exposed edge of the shelter toward safer cover. But even as she moved, she realized with sudden, sharp terror that the raiders' path led directly toward the section of the camp where she stood, and that the guards assigned to protect the healers had been drawn away moments before, responding to a different threat further down the line. She had only a heartbeat to register the danger before a rider bore down on her position, blade raised, and Ren threw herself sideways, more from instinct than any conscious plan, feeling the wind of the blade's passage close enough to stir her hair. "Ren." The voice tore through the chaos, like something breaking, raw and unpracticed, but unmistakably real, unmistakably his, and Ren's entire body went still with shock, even as she scrambled to regain her footing. Cale, having ridden hard from the main defensive line the moment word reached him of the breach near the forward position, launched himself from his horse and placed himself directly between Ren and the retreating raider, his sword, already meeting the attacker's blade, with a strength born from 3 years of restrained fury, finally given somewhere to go. The raider, startled by the sudden intervention and outmatched by the ferocity of the king's assault, broke away and fled toward the ridge, abandoning the attack entirely rather than risk further engagement. Cale did not pursue, turning instead immediately toward Ren, his chest heaving, his eyes wide, with a fear that had clearly overridden every careful restraint he had maintained since the night his brother died.
"You spoke!"
Ren breathed, staring at him in stunned disbelief, her own fear momentarily forgotten in the face of what she had just witnessed. "Cale, you spoke." He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, his expression caught somewhere between wonder and confusion, as though he himself could not fully believe what had just happened. He reached for her instead, pulling her into an embrace fierce enough to communicate everything his voice had not yet found the strength to repeat, and Ren clung to him, amid the continuing chaos of the battlefield, her heart pounding with relief and disbelief in equal measure. Around them, soldiers who had witnessed the exchange stood frozen in stunned silence, word already beginning to spread among the ranks with the speed of wildfire. The silent king, who had not uttered a single sound in 3 long years, had spoken a single word, a name, in a moment of desperate fear for someone he clearly could not bear to lose. The fighting near the forward position subsided within the hour, the raiders retreating fully, once reinforcements arrived from the capital, but the true significance of the day's events had already shifted entirely away from the battle itself. By the time Ren and Cale made their way back toward the palace that evening, exhausted and shaken but alive, the story of the king's single spoken word had already begun its swift journey through every corner of Veyrath, carried by soldiers eager to share what they had witnessed with anyone willing to listen. Nora met them at the ward's entrance, her expression a mixture of relief and profound astonishment as she took in the sight of them both, safe and largely unharmed despite the day's dangers. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did he truly speak?" "One word," Ren confirmed, still hardly believing it herself. "My name, when he thought I was in danger." Nora's eyes filled with something close to tears, and she reached for Cale's hand, holding it gently for a moment, as though confirming with touch what her ears could scarcely accept. 3 years, she said softly. 3 years, of every physician in this kingdom, failing to find a way through your silence, and it took a single moment of fear for someone you love to break through what none of the rest of us could manage. Cale's gaze found Ren's across the small distance between them, and though he still could not find further words that evening, the raw, unguarded gratitude in his expression spoke more clearly than any spoken sentence could have, a promise that whatever silence remained, it would not last much longer, not now that the wall holding it in place had finally, irrevocably, begun to crack. Word of the day's events reached Lord Draven before the sun had fully set, carried to him by a nervous attendant who had witnessed the story spreading through the palace corridors like fire through dry grass. Draven listened in tense silence, his expression carefully schooled into neutrality, even as something colder and more calculating moved behind his eyes. "He spoke," Draven said flatly, once the attendant finished his account. "A single word, in the middle of a battlefield, to protect a healer's apprentice." "That is the account being told, my lord," the attendant confirmed, clearly uncertain how his employer wished him to react to the news. Draven said nothing further for a long moment, turning instead toward the window of his private study, looking out over the darkening city, with an expression that gave away little of the calculations churning beneath his composed exterior. He had spent 2 years building his case carefully, patiently, waiting for the moment when the council would finally be forced to confront the question of a silent king's fitness to rule. A single word, spoken under the extreme duress of battle, complicated that narrative considerably, though it did not, he reasoned silently, entirely undo it. "A single word proves little," Draven said finally, more to himself than to the attendant, still waiting nervously near the door. "The Winter Tribute Council requires a full address to the assembled border lords, not a desperate cry born from panic on a battlefield. Let the court celebrate its miracle tonight. We shall see how much of this newfound voice remains, when the moment truly matters, in front of witnesses who will not be swayed by sentiment alone." He dismissed the attendant with a curt wave, returning his attention to the window and the city beyond it, already turning his thoughts toward how best to reshape his strategy around this unexpected development, unwilling to abandon ambitions built so carefully over years, however inconvenient the day's events had proven to be. Back within the physician's ward, unaware of the calculations already forming in Lord Draven's mind, Wren allowed herself, for the first time since the horn had sounded before dawn, a moment of pure relief. She sat beside Cale on a low bench near the ward's entrance, both of them still marked by the day's dust and exhaustion, and simply breathed, grateful beyond words for the simple fact that they had both survived to see the evening's quiet stillness settle over the palace once more. "I was so afraid," she admitted quietly, her voice still unsteady from the memory of the blade passing so close beside her. "I have never been more afraid in my life." Cale reached for her hand, holding it firmly, and though he could not yet answer her fully in words, the fierce, steady pressure of his grip communicated everything his voice had not yet found strength to repeat. Whatever silence remained between them that evening, it no longer felt like the same silence that had defined the last 3 years of his reign. This silence felt, instead, like the quiet pause before a storm finally breaks, heavy with the promise of everything about to change. The days following the battle at the border brought a change to Cale that the entire palace could see, though it did not arrive all at once, but in careful, halting pieces, like a stream finding its way back through ground that had long forgotten the shape of flowing water. He did not speak often, and when he did, the words came slowly, sometimes only a single syllable, before his throat tightened and refused to offer more. But each attempt came a little easier than the one before it, and each evening in the garden, Wren watched him practice with the same patient determination she had once shown in learning to set a difficult fracture. The morning after the battle, before the halting conversations in the garden had even fully begun, Nora had called Wren aside in the ward, her expression carrying the particular seriousness of a physician about to explain something delicate. A voice recovering from years of trauma does not simply return the way a healed wound closes, Nora explained, laying out several old texts she had gathered from the archive. It must be coaxed back gradually, exercised the way a limb, weakened by long illness, must be exercised, before it can bear its full weight again. Push too hard, too quickly, and the voice may retreat entirely, frightened back into silence by its own overuse. "Then how do we help him?" Wren asked, studying the diagrams and notes Nora had assembled. "Patience," Nora said simply. "Short exercises, repeated gently, never forced beyond what feels comfortable. Reading aloud from simple, familiar texts before attempting anything as demanding as a formal address. And above all, reminding him constantly that failure in practice is not truly failure, only part of the slow work of rebuilding something long neglected." Wren took the guidance seriously, and over the following days, she and Cale settled into a careful routine each evening in the garden, beginning always with simple sentences, before working gradually toward longer passages, Wren offering gentle correction and steady encouragement whenever his voice caught or faltered. "You do not need to force it," she told him one evening, as he sat beside her, his jaw tight with frustration after failing to complete a full sentence for the 3rd time. "Your voice is returning at its own pace, Cale. That pace does not need to match anyone else's expectations, not even your own." "I know," he said, the words rough and unpracticed, but clear enough to understand, and Wren felt her heart lift every time she heard him manage a full response, however brief. "I am simply tired of losing to my own throat." "You are not losing," Wren said gently. "You are healing. Those are different things, even if they sometimes feel the same in the moment." He nodded, some of the tension easing from his shoulders, and reached for her hand the way he often did now, a habit that had become as natural between them as breathing. "Tell me about the shepherd again," he said. "The one Agnes wrote about." Wren smiled, recognizing the story had become something of a comfort to him, a reminder that voices lost to grief could indeed find their way home again. "He lost his voice for nearly 2 years, she said, after watching his son drown in a flooded river. Agnes said no medicine reached him, no treatment eased his silence. It was only a moment of overwhelming feeling, stronger than the walls his grief had built, that finally broke through. And mine broke through fear, Cale said quietly. Fear of losing you. Yes, Wren said, her voice softening. I think, in a way, you had been waiting 3 years for something worth breaking your silence for. I am only glad I happened to be standing in the right place when that moment finally arrived. He studied her for a long moment, something warm and certain settling behind his eyes, and though he did not yet have the words fully ready to express what he was feeling, The intensity of his gaze left little doubt as to the direction his thoughts had taken. Their quiet evening was interrupted by the arrival of Perrin, his expression tight with the particular urgency Wren had come to associate with palace politics, rather than genuine emergencies. "Your Majesty," the steward said, bowing quickly. "Lord Draven has requested the Winter Tribute Council be moved forward, citing the border conflict as reason for urgent reassurance to the assembled territories. The council will convene in 5 days, rather than the full month originally planned." Cale's expression hardened, understanding immediately the calculated nature of the request. 5 days left little time for his voice to strengthen further, little time to prepare an address capable of silencing whatever doubts Lord Draven still intended to raise before the assembled border lords. "He knows my voice is still fragile," Cale said, his words coming easier now, under the weight of clear urgency. "He hopes to force the confrontation before I am fully ready to face it." "Then we will simply have to be ready sooner than he expects," Wren said firmly, though her own stomach tightened at the shortened timeline. The following days passed in a blur of careful preparation, Wren working alongside Nora to develop exercises meant to strengthen Cale's returning voice, drawing on every technique Agnes had ever mentioned regarding recovery from trauma and injury alike. They practiced in the garden each evening, Cale reading short passages aloud from old books, his voice growing steadier with each session, though it remained rough and prone to catching at moments of strong emotion. On the third evening of preparation, Lady Elena arrived unexpectedly at the garden's entrance, her expression urgent despite her usual careful composure. "I must speak with you both," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder, before stepping fully into the garden's shelter. "My father intends more than simply forcing an early council. He has arranged for witnesses among the border lords who are prepared to claim they never heard Cale speak clearly during the battle, that the account has been exaggerated by soldiers eager to see the crown appear stronger than it truly is." "That is a lie," Wren said, anger flaring hot and immediate. "I know it is a lie," Elena said. "But my father does not need truth, only enough doubt to delay the vote further, or to convince the border lords that whatever recovery Cale has shown is temporary, insufficient to guarantee stable leadership going forward." She hesitated, then added, more quietly, "I am telling you this because I do not wish to see my father succeed through deception. Whatever loyalty I owe him as his daughter, I do not believe it extends to helping him destroy a king who has clearly begun to heal, nor the woman who helped him find that healing." Cale reached for Elena's hand, his voice, though still rough, carrying clear and steady gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for your honesty. I will not forget it." Elena nodded, visibly moved by his direct acknowledgement, and slipped back out of the garden as quickly and quietly as she had arrived, leaving Wren and Cale alone with the weight of the fuller danger now facing them. "We cannot simply rely on the memory of soldiers who witnessed the battle," Wren said slowly, her mind already working through the problem the way she once worked through difficult diagnoses. "If Lord Draven intends to plant doubt about what happened, we need something undeniable. Something that cannot be twisted or reframed by clever words." "What do you suggest?" Cale asked. Wren considered carefully before answering. "You need to speak directly to the full council yourself, at length, not simply a single word repeated secondhand through rumor. If the border lords hear your voice themselves, clearly and at length, no claim from Lord Draven or his witnesses will hold any weight against what their own ears have confirmed." Cale's jaw tightened, the familiar fear of failure flickering briefly behind his eyes, but he nodded slowly, understanding the necessity, even as the challenge daunted him. "Then I will need every remaining day to prepare," he said. "And I will need you beside me, Wren, if you are willing. I do not think I could face that hall without knowing you stood somewhere within it." "I will be there," Wren promised, "every step of the way." The final days before the council passed in intense, careful practice, Wren and Nora working alongside Cale late into each evening, strengthening not only his voice but his confidence in using it, coaxing longer and longer passages from him until his words came steadier, more assured, carrying once again some echo of the commanding presence he must have possessed before grief had silenced him entirely. By the night before the council was set to convene, Cale could speak in full, measured sentences, his voice still occasionally rough at moments of deep emotion, but undeniably, unmistakably present. "Are you ready?" Wren asked him quietly, as they sat together in the garden one final time, before the following morning's confrontation. Cale took her hand, his grip steady and sure. "I do not know if I am fully ready," he admitted, his voice clear and warm, despite the honest uncertainty in his words. "But I know I am no longer facing this alone, and that alone makes me stronger than I have been in 3 long years. Whatever Lord Draven intends tomorrow, Ren, I intend to meet it with the voice you helped me find, and the truth neither of us has any reason to fear." She leaned against him, grateful and hopeful in equal measure, and together they watched the last light of evening fade into the deep blue quiet that had witnessed so much of their story unfold, both of them bracing themselves for the confrontation that would decide, once and for all, whether Kael's reclaimed voice would be enough to silence Lord Draven's ambitions forever. Perrin found them there, as full darkness settled over the garden, carrying with him a final report on the council's preparations for the following morning. He paused at the entrance, studying the two of them together, with an expression that had softened considerably since the tense early days of Ren's arrival. "The hall has been prepared, Your Majesty," Perrin said. "Every border lord who was summoned has arrived, along with a considerable number of curious nobles, eager to witness whatever tomorrow brings." He hesitated, then added, with unusual warmth, "For what it is worth, I have served this court through its darkest years, and I have not seen hope move through these halls the way it has these past weeks. Whatever tomorrow holds, Your Majesty, know that more of this palace stands behind you than Lord Draven likely believes." Kael inclined his head, genuine gratitude evident in his expression. "Thank you, Perrin. Your service these past years, even through my silence, has not gone unnoticed." Perrin seemed startled by the direct acknowledgement, and for a moment, something like emotion flickered across his usually composed features before he mastered it and bowed formally, retreating from the garden to leave them their final quiet evening together. Owen arrived shortly after, having drawn the evening watch near the garden's outer gate, and offered his own quiet encouragement before returning to his post. "The guards have been talking of nothing else but tomorrow's council," he said. "Whatever doubts Lord Draven hoped to plant, I think most of the palace already believes in what they witnessed at the border. Tomorrow simply needs to confirm what most of us already know to be true." "I hope you are right," Ren said, watching him retreat back toward his post, the weight of the coming day settling heavier over her with each passing hour. Alone once more, Kael turned to her, his expression thoughtful in the deepening darkness. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty of the coming trial, "I want you to know that these past weeks, however difficult, however dangerous, have given me back more than simply my voice. They have given me back myself, the man I thought I lost entirely the night my brother died. I do not think I can ever fully repay what that has meant to me." "You do not need to repay it," Ren said softly. "Watching you find your way back has been its own reward, Kael. Whatever comes tomorrow, I am simply grateful to have been part of it." They remained together in the garden, long after the last candle had been extinguished in the windows overlooking them, neither willing to be the first to end the quiet, both of them aware that whatever the morning brought, this fragile, hard-won peace between them had already changed everything neither of them had expected to find. When at last they parted for the night, Kael pressed a gentle kiss to her hand, his voice quiet but sure. "Sleep well, Ren," he said. "Tomorrow, we face it together." "Together," she echoed, and carried the word with her all the way back to her small chamber, where sleep came slowly, tangled with hope and worry in equal measure, as the palace settled into its final quiet hours, before the council that would decide so much of what came next. The great hall of Veyrath had never felt so full to Ren as it did the morning of the Winter Tribute Council. Every border lord and senior noble gathered beneath its high stone ceiling, their murmured conversations filling the air with a tension that pressed against her chest the moment she stepped through the tall entrance doors. She found a place near the edge of the hall, close enough to see clearly, though Perrin had insisted, gently but firmly, that she remain among the observers rather than beside the throne itself. A matter of protocol, she understood, even if it left her feeling farther from Kael than she wished to be. Lord Draven stood near the front of the assembly, dressed in his finest ceremonial robes, his expression composed into careful, confident neutrality, as he waited for the session to begin. Lady Elena stood a short distance from her father, her own expression carefully unreadable, though Ren caught her eye briefly across the crowded hall, and received a small, encouraging nod in return. Kael entered from the private chamber behind the throne, dressed in the full ceremonial regalia of his office, and Ren felt her heart swell with quiet pride at the sight of him, straighter and steadier than she had seen him in all the weeks since her arrival. He took his seat upon the throne, and the hall gradually settled into expectant silence, every eye fixed upon the man who had not addressed a full assembly in 3 long years. Perrin stepped forward to open the proceedings formally, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Border lords, esteemed council, we gather today for the Winter Tribute Assembly, and to address, as requested, questions regarding the continued fitness of the crown to lead in the coming season." A murmur rippled through the hall at the pointed phrasing, and Lord Draven stepped forward smoothly, seizing the opening with practiced ease. "My lords, we have all heard the remarkable account from the border conflict several weeks past, a single word spoken under the extreme duress of battle. I do not dismiss the significance of that moment, but I put to this council a fair question. Can a single word, spoken in fear and chaos, truly satisfy the ancient requirement that our king address this assembly directly, clearly, and at length, as tradition demands of any ruler seeking to lead us through the challenges of the coming season?" Several border lords nodded, murmuring among themselves, and Wren felt her stomach tighten with anxious anticipation, watching Cale's expression remain steady, despite the weight of the challenge laid so directly before him. "I understand the council's caution," Cale said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, steady and unmistakably present, drawing a collective gasp from those who had never before heard him speak at length. 3 years ago, I lost my brother on the night of my coronation, in a duel meant only for ceremony, never intended to end in tragedy. I lost more than my brother that night. I lost my voice, my confidence, and for a long time, I believed I had lost the right to lead this kingdom at all." The hall fell into absolute silence, every noble and border lord listening intently, many visibly stunned by the directness of the admission from a king who had spent 3 years hiding behind careful, guarded distance. "I did not recover my voice through medicine, or through the passage of time alone," Cale continued, his tone growing steadier with each sentence, drawing strength visibly from the act of speaking itself. "I recovered it because a healer's apprentice, who arrived at this palace by pure accident, refused to let me carry my grief entirely alone. She listened when I could not speak. She stayed when others feared to. And when my silence finally broke, it broke not from weakness, but from love, from a fear of losing someone I had come to care for more deeply than I believed myself still capable of feeling." Lord Draven's composed expression faltered slightly, sensing the direction the king's address was taking, but he held his position, waiting for an opening to reassert his challenge. "I understand this council's concern for stability," Cale continued, rising now from his throne to stand before the assembled lords directly. "But I ask you to consider what stability truly means. Is it the appearance of unshaken strength, maintained through silence and careful distance? Or is it a ruler who has faced his deepest grief honestly, who has allowed himself to heal rather than simply endure, and who now stands before you prepared to lead with both the strength of his position and the wisdom earned through genuine, hard-fought recovery?" He turned then, extending his hand toward the edge of the hall where Wren stood among the observers, and every eye in the assembly followed the gesture, understanding immediately its significance. "I would ask this council, and this kingdom, to recognize Wren Sable, not simply as a healer who happened to cross my path, but as the woman I intend to make my queen," Cale said, his voice carrying clear and unwavering through the stunned silence of the hall. "She did not seek influence or position when she arrived here. She sought only to help ease suffering wherever she found it, and in doing so, she gave me back a voice I believed lost forever. I can think of no one better suited to stand beside me as we lead this kingdom forward." The hall erupted into a swell of reaction, murmurs and gasps, mixing with a scattering of approving voices from border lords who had clearly been moved by the sincerity of the king's words. Lord Draven stepped forward one final time, his expression tight with barely restrained frustration. "Your Majesty, this is a matter for the full council to consider carefully, not simply announced in the midst of an address meant to address questions of fitness to rule." "Then let the council consider it," Cale said evenly, meeting Draven's gaze directly without flinching. "I have addressed this assembly clearly and at length, as tradition requires. I have spoken honestly of my grief, my recovery, and my intentions for this kingdom's future. If any lord among you still doubts my fitness to lead after what you have witnessed today, I welcome that doubt to be voiced openly, rather than whispered through quiet alliances and carefully planted rumors." The challenge landed heavily, and several border lords who had clearly been courted by Draven's earlier maneuvering shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to voice openly what they had been willing to support through quieter channels. One by one, murmurs of support began to rise from among the assembly. Border lords who had witnessed firsthand the account of the battle, now adding their voices in favor of a king who had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, both his strength and his renewed capacity to lead. Lord Draven, recognizing the tide had turned decisively against him, bowed stiffly, his expression carefully composed despite the evident sting of defeat. "The council recognizes His Majesty's fitness to continue his reign," he said, the words clearly costing him considerable effort to deliver. "The matter of succession stability is, for now, satisfied." The hall erupted into genuine applause then, a sound Wren suspected the ancient stones had not heard in celebration for many years, and she felt tears gather unbidden in her eyes as Chaol descended from the throne and crossed the hall directly toward her, ignoring every protocol that might have kept them apart in that stunned, joyful moment. "I meant every word," he said quietly, taking her hands in his voice steady and warm, despite the weight of everything that had just transpired. "Will you have me, Wren? Not as your king, but simply as the man you helped find his way back to himself." "Yes," Wren said, laughter and tears mixing freely as she answered without a moment's hesitation. "Yes, Chaol. Every part of you. Silence and voice both. I choose all of it." The hall's applause swelled further as he pulled her into an embrace before the entire assembled court, and even Lord Draven, standing at the edge of the celebrating crowd, could not entirely mask the reluctant acknowledgement that whatever ambitions he had once held for his daughter's future, the kingdom before him had chosen a different, more genuine path forward, one built not on careful political arrangement, but on truth honestly faced and love freely given. Whatever challenges still lay ahead for Veyrath and its newly healed king, she knew, standing there in the golden light of their coronation day, that they would face them together, voices and hearts finally, fully unbound. Later that evening, after the formal ceremonies had concluded and the grand hall had emptied of its assembled nobles, Wren found Nora waiting quietly near the physician's ward, a place that had become, over the past months, something like a second home within the palace's vast walls. "You look happier than I have ever seen you," Nora said, embracing her warmly. "I still remember the frightened girl who set a rider's broken leg outside Ashcombe's gates, uncertain of everything that awaited her here." "I could not have imagined any of this," Wren admitted, laughing softly at the memory. "I thought I was simply delivering medicine to a sick child that morning." "Sometimes, the smallest moments carry the largest consequences," Nora said. "I am glad I chose to bring you here, Wren. Whatever the kingdom gained in a healed king, I believe I gained something equally precious in watching you become the woman you were always meant to be." Owen found her shortly after, grinning widely despite the formal solemnity still expected of the guards on duty. "I told you not to be afraid of him," he said, recalling their conversation from the earliest days of her arrival. "Though I confess, even I did not imagine it would end quite like this." "Neither did I," Wren admitted, smiling at the memory of his early counsel. "Thank you, Owen, for your honesty that first week. I do not think I would have found my footing here half as quickly without it." Lady Elena approached as well, her expression warm and free of the careful caution that had marked their earlier meetings. "I am glad to see the kingdom in such capable hands," she said. "Both of yours." "Thank you for your courage," Wren said, remembering the risk Elena had taken in warning them of her father's schemes. "I do not think we would have faced the council so successfully without your honesty." Elena smiled, something lighter in her expression than Wren had seen before. Perhaps this kingdom needed a reminder that honesty, however difficult, always serves it better than careful, quiet deception. I am simply glad to have played a small part in that lesson. In the weeks that followed, Veyrath began to change in ways that rippled far beyond the palace's grand halls. Chaol's voice, once lost to grief, grew steadier with each council session, each public address, each quiet evening spent with Wren in the garden that had witnessed the earliest, most fragile beginnings of their bond. He established new protections for healers and physicians throughout the kingdom. Inspired, he told the court openly, by the woman who had reminded him that true strength lay not in silent endurance, but in the courage to be honestly, vulnerably human. Lady Elena, freed at last from her father's careful ambitions, found her own path forward within the court, eventually taking on a role advising the crown on matters of border diplomacy, her honesty and integrity earning her a respect that had nothing to do with her father's name. Lord Draven, though never fully reconciled to the outcome, gradually withdrew from active scheming, recognizing at last that the kingdom's loyalty had shifted too firmly toward its healed and honest king, to be reclaimed through quiet maneuvering alone. On the day of their coronation as king and queen together, Ren stood beside Kael, before the same assembled court that had once doubted them both, and listened as he addressed the kingdom with a voice fully restored, strong and steady, carrying none of the silence that had once defined his reign. 3 years ago, I believed silence was the only way to survive my grief, Kael told the gathered crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the hall and beyond, to the city gathered outside the palace gates, to witness the historic day. I have learned since then that true strength is found not in silence, but in the courage to speak honestly, to grieve openly, and to love without fear of what that love might cost. I owe that lesson to my queen, who arrived at this palace by accident, and who has since become the very heart of everything I hope to build for this kingdom's future. Ren took his hand as the crowd's cheers rose around them, carrying with her every memory of the quiet garden evenings, the shared grief, the desperate battlefield fear that had finally broken through years of silence, and the simple, steady love that had grown between them, despite every obstacle placed in their path. Whatever challenges still lay ahead for Veyrath and its newly healed king, she knew, standing there in the golden light of their coronation day, that they would face them together, voices and hearts finally, fully unbound.